We are live, so we're going to open with a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for this new day, and we thank you for the chance to be together. And we pray, Lord, that you would be with us as we talk about Romans chapter 1, the Apostle Paul, this funny word nature, and help us, Lord, to hear your word and to be able to apply it to our lives. So hear our prayer now in the name of Jesus. Amen. Okay. Well, let's get started. Let's see. Last week we talked about this word nature. Also last week we talked about the fact that some words, their meaning and their understanding changes through time. And I used the passage in Matthew, "In my Father's house there are many mansions." And if you hear the word mansion, what do you think of? A large home. Beautiful, fancy, wealthy, lots of rooms. The King James Version translated Matthew, "In my Father's house there are many mansions." The King James Version was translated in the 16th century. Now, if you look at something like the NIV today in the 21st century, you will see that mansions goes away. And a lot of people, when they read something like the NIV, will be upset by that because they said, why did the NIV take away my mansions? The problem is that really the Greek word for us means something more like resting places or rooms. So you might translate that passage, "In my Father's house there are many rooms." And if you had never had the King James Version of the Bible, you would have never had the idea of mansions. And it's the fact that language evolves over time. Now, we're talking about this word nature. And if I ask you to maybe give me a sentence where you use the word nature, what would you say? Nature is beautiful. What do we mean by nature in that sentence? You just used the word nature again. Trees, mountains, waterfalls, flowers. Now, is that grass outside there nature? What's the difference between the grass in this little courtyard and what's in that field beyond the parking lot? Weeds. What's the definition of a weed? Nature where you don't want it. That's the definition of a weed. So last week we looked at C.S. Lewis's this little quote from C.S. Lewis's Miracles. Here it is. Where Lewis uses 5 different sentences to talk about this word nature. Now, he in this book is contrasting nature from supernature, the naturalist from the supernaturalist. So he has 5 sentences. I begin by considering the following sentences. Are those his natural teeth or a set? What does that sentence mean? Okay, so were these the teeth that emerged out of his gums, the first set and then the second set? Or did a dentist go in and pull them out and put other things in his mouth? The dog in his natural state is covered with fleas. All right, human intervention. The dog will scratch, the dog will bite. You've all seen dogs working on their fleas. All the scratching and biting isn't going to get rid of it. Well, if you have a dog, you know what you do. For a while there was the collars. Now you give them that little pill, right? Once a month you give him that little pill. The pill puts chemicals in his bloodstream. The flea sucks blood out of the dog. The poison is in the bloodstream, kills the flea, breaks up the flea's cycle. Super complex. It's the best thing to do with dogs and fleas. I love to get away from tilled land and metalled roads and be alone with nature. This one has a capital N. That's what Edie was talking about. Do be natural. Why are you so affected? It's a little different, a little harder to, let's say, you remember that famous scene in Casablanca where the guy is, the police officer is shocked that there's gambling? Okay, that's sort of become a meme. So let's say someone who indulges in a lot of drama in their life, and then you're talking to them and they're getting dramatic about something that happens all the time. It's like you're putting on an act. You're putting on an act. Okay, number 5. It may have been wrong to kiss her, but it was very natural. What does that mean? No restrictions on your impulses. The word nature, as Lewis points out here, comes from the Greek word physis, and then gets changed, which means to grow. And so we look at that grass, and it isn't the case that that dirt right there has been there for 100,000 years as it is right now, and we all just sort of tiptoed around and put buildings around it. No, we cleared it. You know, this kind of grass, my guess is not, now listen to my language again, native to California. What do I mean? It wasn't here originally. All right, human beings brought it in. And this, so last week we talked about nature and we talked about reason, and then we talked about God. And C.S. Lewis's book Miracles basically makes the point that when we use the language excluding, basically by definition, saying the line between human, there's a line between human and nature. The grass out there, people did that. It's not natural. Natural is when there are no human touch. We haven't done anything. That's what we mean by natural. Now, if you go through Costco or the grocery store, on lots of packages you'll see organic and you'll see natural. What do we mean in those cases? What's organic? See, and this is what's funny, because if a chemist would take a blade of grass and analyze it, would the chemist find chemicals in that blade of grass?
Yeah, probably.
We're all filled with chemicals. Well, there's another funny use of the word too, isn't it? The difference between organic is often synthetic. What we mean by that is synthetic fertilizer. What's synthetic fertilizer? Man-made. What's organic fertilizer? Animal-made. Okay. And synthetic fertilizer comes out of, well, at the beginning of the 20th century, we learned to fixate oxygen. That sounds weird. Fixate nitrogen. What happens in the soil when you use manure to fertilize the soil is that the manure takes nitrogen and puts it into the soil. Where does the manure get the nitrogen? From the animal. Where does the animal get the nitrogen? From the air. Because the air we breathe is mostly nitrogen. What happened at the beginning of the 20th century is they figured out how to get nitrogen from the air into chemical form to put into the ground directly. That's a really good question. Because there's a really fun book on this called The Alchemy of Air. And a lot of people believe that the Earth's carrying capacity for the amount of food that can be grown here organically is 3.5 to 4 billion people. How many people are in the world today? Almost 8 billion. We would not have food. And this process was actually developed by a German Jew who also developed a pesticide called Zyklon. Ever hear of Zyklon? Zyklon B was the gas used in the Nazi concentration camps. The same scientist developed it, and he was a German Jew. Germany, at the beginning of the 20th century, was facing a crisis. Its land was worn out. It didn't have the best land. This is part of the reason that Hitler had eyes on Ukraine. See, all this history holds together. And Germany was facing a food crisis because it didn't know if it could feed its people because its land was worn out. And this German Jewish scientist developed the ability to take nitrogen from the air to create synthetic fertilizers to put nitrogen back in the soil because plants need nitrogen in the soil to thrive. The other thing that the nitrogen helped for was another key thing that you need nitrogen for is explosives. So the same nitrogen that was used to feed Germany was also used to make the munitions for warfare ever since. When Timothy McVeigh blew up Oklahoma City, he didn't break into an armory to find munitions. He used diesel and fertilizer to make his explosives to destroy that building. The same thing that we use to feed ourselves is the same thing we use to blow each other up. Interesting, isn't it? Natural basically says without human reason, and by reason I mean things like intentionality. What is intentionality? So Carol came this morning and said, I did it again. What did you do this morning? What did you do again this morning, Carol? She spilled coffee on herself. Let me ask you a question, Carol. Did you do that intentionally? No. No, she did not do it intentionally. Why not? Don't you like spilling hot liquids on yourself and staining your car and your garments?
Oh, it just
Love the smell of coffee. I'm going to dribble it on myself. It was, let me use another sentence. It was natural for Carol to spill coffee. Well, look at our definitions.
Natural here, I have put no human touch.
Okay.
And I was putting sugar and cream in the coffee for my dear friend Carmen. I couldn't get the lid back on the cup. And that's Burger King's fault.
This is where it gets tricky. Okay, so now let's read. Why are we talking about this word? Because when we get into this word means a lot. Okay, we'll get a running start. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all impiety and unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what can be known about God is evident among them, for God made it clear to them. For from the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, both his eternal power and his deity, are discerned clearly. C.S. Lewis, in his book on miracles, would say, we can see God through our capacity to reason. Can you give me an example of why we make this categorization between nature and reason? The dog in his natural state has fleas. Yeah, what do? We get rid of the fleas. Last week we talked about, so here's natural. We have a dog with fleas. Here's unnatural, let's say reason. Okay, what's the difference with the dog in this state? You put him in a house. Are houses natural? Especially not for dogs. And you also don't want fleas in the house on the dog, because fleas get on the dog and fleas look around. Anywhere else we can go? Oh, there's another warm-blooded creature. Bang, onto you. And before you know it, you get these little flea bites. Now, fortunately for us, fleas can't engage in their reproductive cycle with our blood. With dogs, they can. With us, they can't. So, what other differences are there with the dog? Does the dog pee on the carpet? Sometimes. You house train the dog. So you have a domesticated animal. Now, where do our dogs come from? Wolves. Would you want a wolf in your house? No. Not even a dingo. There are wild dogs in Africa. There are wild dingoes in Australia. Wolves are, generally speaking, where the genetic line of our dogs. But if you look at our dogs, they don't look like wolves. Their snouts are shorter. They're smaller. And here's another fun fact about dogs. Dogs don't make eye contact with other dogs. Dogs make eye contact with humans. Where did dogs learn that? If your dog is watching you, see, what dogs have figured out is that if you want to know what people are thinking about, watch someone's eyes. If you're sitting down and the dog is watching you and you look at something, it might be food. The dog is going to look at your eyes, look where you're looking, and look. They're the only animal that does that in the world. And they learned that from us. Chimps can't do that. Chimps are smarter than dogs, but they can't do that. Dogs can and do, and we don't even know half the time. Dogs have learned from us. So then the question is, have we domesticated the dog, or has the dog domesticated us? True. So now, what is a supernatural dog? The talking dog. Dogs can do a whole lot but they can't talk. That would be supernatural. So reason. All right, back to the text. So C.S. Lewis says, part of the idea, the witness of God around us, is our capacity to reason. We have colonized dogs. We have domesticated dogs, and we have transformed dogs, and our capacity to transform dogs is godlike. And that's one reason we think, well, if there are dogs here and we're here, might there be something colonizing us so that we don't pee on the carpet, so that we don't do what's natural? But now, what's tricky is that I've just changed the definition of this word natural. Because generally speaking, when we use this word, we exclude human beings. And this happened from a period of time after the Protestant Reformation called the Enlightenment, when suddenly, and I've been making this arc before, we talked about the pagan world, right? We have the arena, and we have the agent. And we talked about the fact that in the pagan world, the gods are sort of these big people in the sky. But the arena, one Jewish scholar called the meta-divine realm, because there are aspects of the arena that even impinge on the gods, just like they impinge on us. In the Hebrew story, there is no agent higher than God. And so the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts says, in him we live and move and have our being. After the Enlightenment, in some ways, we sort of re-entered the meta-divine realm, but instead of saying things like fate, we say things like laws of nature. We are subject to laws of nature. But now we also have this capacity of reason through which we defy laws of nature. Okay. Is this my real hair?
Yes.
Yes. How did you know?
Because I know you, Pastor. I've seen you like this many times.
Now, for those watching, you should be aware that I am sitting in a room with 7 women. Sorry, no, I don't know how old Barbara is. Del, yeah, okay. I'm pretty sure that all of the 7 women in this room are older than I am. And you know what I'm not going to go around and ask? I'm not going to go around and ask how old. You know what else I'm not going to go around and ask? Ah! Is that your real color? A bunch volunteered the answer that was yes. Others said nothing. Why? Why this issue about natural? Why, again, I could get hair plugs. I could wear a toupee. I could do a lot I could take pills. I could do something about losing my hair. But I haven't. I haven't because I didn't care so much. I have enough on my face. If I could transplant this up here, I'd have lots of white curly hair. It would look quite funny. Reason is how we interfere with the laws of nature. But again, this way of viewing the world is only about 500 years old. This is part of the reason our language has changed. All right, let's keep reading. Verse 21. Romans 1, verse 21. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their reasoning. Futile in their reasoning? Why would Paul say that? What aren't they doing? Now, Paul is in this phase right here. Because if they were reasoning, they would have a relationship with this God. They would honor this God and they would obey this God in the same way that you might honor and obey the government around you. Why do you honor and obey the government around you, even when you disagree with the government? Let's say you're driving down I-5 and the speed limit is 65 and everyone is doing 75 or 80, which they are. And you're going to say, you're not even going to say it, I am not going to honor the government right now. I'm going to do 80 along with everybody else. Why? Because you can get away with it, because we're in a hurry. Also part of safety, because if you do 65, everyone's whizzing around you. So, now, it's really important here in this passage, and we're going to get to this. So, Romans 1 through 16 is often known as an intro. And we've talked about the nuance of that. The next big section has 3 parts. And there's chapter 1, 18 to the end. There's chapter 2, and there's chapter 3, but they're all together. Romans 1, 18 talks about Gentiles. Romans 2 talks about Jews. Romans 3 talks about everyone. This is really important in understanding what Paul is about to say. Because as we've noted before, Paul is a Roman and he's a Jew. And he is trying to do the translation between the two communities. So what he's talking about all the way to the end of the chapter is the people that he grew up with and is living with the Romans. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their reasoning, and their senseless hearts were darkened. We talked about that last week. How does failing to reason make our hearts dark? Let's say your mama always told you, no, don't sleep around. I think I'm being oppressed by the patriarchy. I'm going to go sleeping around. All right, so you go sleeping around. What sometimes happens. You're not really honored by the men you're sleeping with. You might have a few unintended pregnancies. A lot of things might happen. Then you wake up, and you're 45 years old and you're not 25 years old. When you're 25 years old, guess what? You wanted to sleep around, you wanted male attention, you're 25 years old. You had a lot of male attention. Now you're 45 years old. Pickings aren't quite as good as they were when I was 25. And now you're looking over at some other people and they got married. And they stuck to their marriage. Yeah, it wasn't perfect. Yeah, there were ups and downs. But they got married, had some kids, started to build a life. Suddenly, those decisions between 25 and 45 don't look so happy. And then someone comes and says, they're complaining about, I can't get the men I want anymore. And someone says, well, look what you've done for the last 20 years. What do you know? What was that about? Why is this 45-year-old so defensive? My wife and I were watching Survivor last night, and there's one season where there's one woman, she's an older woman. She presents herself as the expert on everything. And there was one of those little competitions, and there was a balance beam competition. And one of the things, if you read books on aging, one of the things that diminishes pretty clearly while you age is your balance. So this woman who's probably 50 years old, she was really struggling with balance. And the woman who was 20 years old just zipped right through. At the end of the competition, she said, everybody likes her, but she failed for 10 minutes on that balance thing, and I zipped right through. And it's like, we all watched this. The 25-year-old zipped right through. The 50-year-old struggled. She didn't see this? Edie can talk to you about that. Was she lying? No, lying and denial is not the same thing. She really believes part of her, she zipped right through that course. All of us watched. She couldn't do it. Denial is a powerful thing. We double down on ideas sometimes so much, I refuse to hear. You see this in politics all the time. I'm not going to listen to the other side because they're always wrong. Oh, okay. Well, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Probably they're wrong about some things, and probably they're right about other things. Same with the other side. But we double down on denial. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their reasoning. A person in denial is futile in their reasoning. Everybody hates me because of this. Probably everybody doesn't hate you, and it's probably not because of that. And so they spend thousands of dollars in therapy to try and get that straight. Sometimes with success and sometimes not. And their senseless hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. That woman on Survivor that claimed she zipped through, the rest of her tribe looked at her like, one guy even said, she's a crazy lady. She's a crazy lady. We all saw it. And exchanged the glory of the immortal God for the likeness of an image of mortal human beings and birds and quadrupeds and reptiles. And we talked about the fact that in this worldview, what happens is you're just always relating to these images, some of them even with astrology, simply up in the sky. And so when Moses is late coming down from Mount Sinai, Aaron makes a golden calf. And see, here is your God that delivered you from Egypt. It looks like a calf. And we look at that and say, oh, that's crazy. We'd rather have look like a human being, something like that. Therefore, God gave them over, and we talked about that last week. This gave them over is in verse 24. Gave them over is in verse 26. Gave them over is in verse 28. And we talked about last week, what's an example of someone giving them over? So your son or your daughter, you've talked to your son and your daughter and you said, look, I'm older than you. I've lived through a lot of things in my life. If you keep pursuing this, you're not going to get out of it what you want. And your kid says, yeah. And they keep doing it. And so finally, as a parent, you realize, I'm not helping them. Go ahead. No more curfew. No more restraints. Might even kick you out of the house. Or the door will be locked when you get home and you can sleep out on the porch. I'm giving you over to what you want. And that's what it says. God gave the Gentiles over to what they wanted. And then their civilization produced the fruits of that giving over. Therefore, God gave them over in the desires of their hearts, and we talked about epithumia, to immorality, that their bodies would be dishonored among themselves. And we talked about we talked about this New York Times article where this girl she's really big about giving permission. And so the guy, can I put my arm around you? Yes. Can I hug you? Yes. Can I kiss you? Yes. Can I? And then all the way on down into sexual intimacy. At every point, he asked permission. She said yes, which is, of course, the most unromantic thing you can think of. And then they did this for like 2 dates, and then he disappeared. And she complained. He's not honoring me. Well, didn't he stop and ask your permission each time? I wanted something more. Oh, did you say to him, before I'm sexually intimate with you, I want a commitment that you and I are going to be together for a long time, if not forever. Did you ask him for that? Well, no. Well, why not? Because he might have said, what I'm really after is sort of the sex, and I've got a marketplace here, and I can get it cheaper from someone else. Not a lot of honoring when sexuality is part of a marketplace. So they exchanged the truth of God with a lie. So when the teenager that you're trying to instill some wisdom in says, you don't love me. Well, is that, no, I'm actually talking to you because I do love you. You don't love me. And does that teenager actually believe that? In the moment, maybe, yes and no. And they worshiped and served the creation rather than the creator. We talked about that. Because of this, God gave them over, second giving them over, to degrading passions. Okay. Degrading passions. What would degrading passions be? So the word passion is just the pathos. We know that word. But and actually the word degrading is the word for honor. Remember I told you about the little prefix A? Dishonoring passions. So that woman in the New York Times article, there's a dishonor that's in the relationship. For females exchanged the natural, there's that word, relations for those contrary to nature. And likewise also males, abandoning the natural relations with the female, were inflamed their desire towards one another, males with males, committing with the shameless deed and receiving in themselves the penalty that was necessary for their error. Okay. What's happening? Now, why did we spend so much time talking about this word natural? Because here's the question. This, of course, touches on the huge fight of same-sex attraction and behavior, which right now in the church is the biggest fight there is and has been for the last generation. Someone who is same-sex attracted, is their attraction for a member of the same sex natural? Okay. And now my question is, what do we mean by that word natural when we answer yes to that? Because I think in terms of how we use the word natural today, the answer to that is yes, right? Because this person didn't wake up and decide, I want to go against the grain and be attracted to people of the same sex. For all of us, sexual attraction is rather natural. And what do I mean by the word when I use it in that context? Personal. Oh, there's another complicated word. We're not helping our case here. Okay, it's not reasoning. If you listen to stories of when people look at even the language we use. Falling in love. We don't say planning in love. Why do we say falling in love? Was it natural for Carol's coffee to spill? Yes. Why? Gravity. Gravity. Carol can say, I didn't spill my coffee. Gravity did. And all these little cups that you have in front of you are unnatural. Why? They're stopping gravity. If you were to take away that cup or that water bottle or that cup, the liquid would just go. That's natural. It's gravity. When we fall in love, I saw this person, and it's, and there it was. I didn't plan it. It's natural. But now Paul says, females exchange the natural relations for those contrary to nature. And it's like we read this verse and we say, we don't even think. Because usually what happens when Christians read this verse is either they say, yep, same-sex relationships are wrong, proves it here, or they say, if they want to keep the Bible, they say, well, it must mean something else. I better learn Greek, and maybe if I learn Greek, then I'll know the answer. That's not going to help you. Or they say, well, see, patriarchy, heteronormity. See, all of this past stuff is just the corruption of ancient people who wanted to control the lives of men and of women and of gay people. All kinds of things come about. This is tricky because if we go back to this question right here, on what basis of which story do you believe creation? Okay. Here's a question. Did death come before the fall? Okay. Here's another question. At what level of death is normal human behavior essential? Let me ask you this question. This stuff on the outside of our body that flakes, you know what it is? Dead cells. There's a lot of really naughty questions that came up. It's like, well, death doesn't come before the fall. Okay, well, plant death? Well, they were chomping on them. They were eating plants. So they're killing plants. Well, is that what we mean by death? What about dead skin cells? Your body cannot live without dead skin cells. The dead skin cells are your protective layer against all sort of things. Did Adam and Eve have dead skin cells? I mean, these questions just get naughty. And so what we basically have is a question of, what is the story of what is natural? And if you look at all of the fights between, let's say, creationists and let's say secularists, when did the laws of nature start? Was there gravity in the Garden of Eden? So there's a lot of naughty questions that get into this question of natural. Because a biologist will say death is natural. Because actually for those plants to live, the leaves fall off the tree, they go to the ground, they decompose, they put the nitrogen back in the soil, they drop, you have this nitrogen cycle. We have all these naughty questions now about death because of all of our ideas about laws of nature and science. And they muck around with this question of natural. And so one of the big fights about same-sex marriage is same-sex attraction natural? And the way we answer this question has to do with our definition of natural. Does same-sex attraction come unbidden? What do I mean by that? Did someone wake up today and say, I want to be gay? Now, right now, I think that's happening to a degree because kids have figured out if they're not gay, they kind of have lower status, and you can gain status in your community if you are gay. In some communities, you'll be celebrated. You know what month you'll be celebrated? June. Next June, next June, go into an airport. All of the airlines are celebrating you. It's like a month of birthdays because you're gay. Now, you don't even have to necessarily be same-sex attracted to be gay. You just have to say maybe you're same-sex attracted, even if you never act on it. I mean, but that's where human status gets really tricky. Now, 30 years ago, you sort of kept it quiet. Now, you sort of kept it quiet because there's going to be derision if you say, if you're a guy and you say, I kind of like men. 30 years ago, don't say it. Keep it on the down low. Keep it in the corners. Keep it in the closet. Today, come out, depending, of course, on kind of where you live. That's right. You get community support like that. And so the world has changed very quickly. But this hinges on this question, is it natural? And if you take the dominant definition of natural today, and in fact, to a degree, the other definitions we've been looking at, you would say yes. Like the dog has fleas, I'm attracted to this kind of person. I don't ask for it. It just happens. So then the question is, what on earth does the Apostle Paul mean by natural relations and contrary to nature? It has everything to do with this idea about intention and design. If you read the Genesis stories, you very much get the idea that we were not designed for death. If you talk to a doctor will say it's natural to die. In fact, if I were to say our death is unnatural, most people would say you're out of your mind. It gets into this question of, remember when we had God, reason, nature, and that each imposes and gives to the next level? This gets very tricky into the question of time, and I'm going to use a Greek word because it's still the best one. Telos. Telos in English means end. It also means goal. Now, if I were to ask you, what is your ideal self physically? Okay, about 30 pounds lighter. Were you ever 30 pounds lighter? Absolutely. Now, how old were you when you were 30 pounds lighter? I'll use me. My ideal self is probably closer to 40 or 50 pounds lighter. I'm tall. I can carry a lot of weight. It's one of the first things my doctor said when I had my new doctor. He said, he got on the scale, he said, you're tall, you can carry a lot of weight. He didn't say that as a compliment. He said that as a warning. Because what it means is that if I were 5'8", 240, all of you would look at Pastor Paul and say, Pastor Paul's a little heavy. But because I'm 6'4", 240, you say, well, Pastor Paul's not that bad, not that big. Okay. How old was I when I was 190, 200? Any guesses? You can all guess. I'm sure you'll hit it. 25, 20, 18. I was my ideal person when I was 18, 20, 22. Now, would I say I was my ideal person when I was 18, 20, or 22? Comparing myself, me now versus me then? How does me now versus me then evaluate myself when I was 18 or 20? I didn't think about my weight when I was 18. It was extremely natural for me. But what about my ideal self? See, when I was 18 or 20, well, I thought I knew everything. Now I look at my 20-year-old and I think, didn't know so much. Glad there was no such thing as social media for me to parade all of my brilliance before the world. Okay, so please tell me, when was my ideal self? Well, none of it's ideal. Oh, there's a Christian among us. Because when I was 18 or 20, physiologically, I was at my ideal self. But I didn't know a lot. Now that I'm in my late 50s, I think I know a lot. I think I know more at least, but I realize a lot of what I don't know. 20 years from now, hopefully my mind will still be there. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Maybe I'll be sharper, maybe I'll be less sharp. I don't know. Will I be more of my ideal self 20 years from now than I am now? It's really hard to tell. But here's the question. What is my natural self? And this makes it very tricky because, again, if you go all the way back to the dog, my natural self involves, well, see, here we have the problem. Human beings can't be natural according to the majority uses of this word. And so then we tend to say the natural person is the person unimpeded by reason. And then, so a same-sex attracted person says, well, I'm naturally same-sex attracted. Paul's just using the word wrong. Paul is actually using the word in a very different way, because my natural self is in some ways my optimal self. Okay, yeah, but we like to say that sort of after Rousseau, but we don't let 8-year-olds run the country. Because childlike, we say childlike is good, childish is bad, but children are both. Oh, that's good. That's natural. So then back to C.S. Lewis's question, or C.S. Lewis's quote, it may have been wrong to kiss her, but it was natural. That's uninhibited. Oh, wow, attracted, grab, take, use. Oh, I don't like her anymore. In fact, men, studies have shown, men love sexual novelty way more than women. Men will, let's say you have a man in a marriage for a long time, and their frequency of sex with the partner just keeps going down. and maybe below the wife's comfort level, and the wife says, gosh, I can't, can't get anything out of the old guy. And then boom, you discover he's having an affair. She's like, what? A psychologist will say that's sexual novelty. She was just, well, what makes her better than me? Well, she probably isn't better or worse. She's just new. Exciting. So that's uninhibited. We don't value that because we as a group look at that and say, oh, guess what? Yeah, she's new today. She'll be old tomorrow. And so the guy that is just on from one person to another, he is doing something very natural. It is absolutely natural for the guy to want as many sexual partners as possible. And evolutionary biologists will look at that and say, that is perfectly natural. According to what we know about women have to gestate for 9 months, men can fertilize multiple women in one evening. Biologically, according to our ideas of Darwinism, that's an advantage. How many descendants are there of Genghis Khan in the world? This is natural. Paul says, no, it's unnatural, because his definition of natural has everything to do with God's design. And that makes perfect sense, because if creation is God's design, then that is in fact the source of the world. Paul assumes that in the Word. And Paul's not alone in that. Many ancients had a similar idea about that which is natural. And I can pull that out of you when I ask you, if I say, what's your natural self? You'd say, here I am, maybe without some hair color. You'd say, well, you're going to have to actually dial a whole lot back from that. Maybe without your house or your car or fixation of nitrogen food supply, or, if you want to find a natural human being, you can't find it by definition of how we use the word natural. But if I say, what is your ideal self? On one hand, you say, this person has never existed. Physiologically, I was my ideal self when I was 20. Maybe cognitively and socially, I was my ideal self when I was 50 or 60. Maybe career-wise, in terms of if I was a professional athlete, I was my ideal self when I was, well, this is even tricky. Is LeBron James today a better basketball player than he was when he was 18? It's kind of hard. He's got a lot more skills now. He's got a lot more nuance now. He's got a lot more smarts now, but he's using that smarts to compensate for all of the strength and agility that he has lost in the last 20 years. So this word better is a really hard word to think about. And when Paul says natural here, what he means is God's intention for the ideal or the role that male and female were going to play in this world was not male, male, female, female. It was male, female. And we have clues to that because two men can have sex forever and something won't happen. Two women can have sex forever and something won't happen. If you suddenly throw a switch and all the men in the world were attracted to other men and all the women in the world were attracted to other women, guess what would stop? Civilization would end. In other words, in some ways, these folks are free riders. They're dependent on the breeders to keep the whole thing going. And evolutionary biologists will say, well, that's why these are natural, pay attention to the word, minorities in the population. Because they can't exist on their own. Now, Dave Rubin, who's a popular YouTuber, he and his husband just posted pictures of their two babies. the ultrasounds of their 2 babies. And you might say, wow, you're looking awfully slim for... Oh, where are those babies? Well, they're in a couple of different women. Well, how are these women holding your babies? Why are these women holding your babies? Well, we pay them to hold our babies. Oh. And you can think about that. Is that natural? See, this word natural is really complex. And now you just threw another funny word. Right for what? For all of this. That's right. That's exactly right. And so Paul is looking at the Roman world and saying, I told the story about Nero. Nero had a wife, loved her. She was carrying his unborn baby. Came home one night, was angry. What's natural to do when you're angry with your wife? Hurt her. He beat her up. She not only miscarried, she died. Nero felt bad. He loved her. Well, if you loved her, why would you beat her up? We can talk a lot about that. So guess what he decided to do? And so he was sad. And so a search went out through all the Roman Empire for a new wife. Guess what they found? There was a slave boy that looked just like her. Guess what they did? Now, he was probably a 14, 15-year-old, because a 14, 15-year-old can sort of look like a natural woman, but if you let things go another 5 years, so they castrated him. And then Nero actually married this eunuch. So we call it castrated male. And the Roman court was frenzied to try to figure out how this eunuch could become pregnant so that Nero and his wife could have a natural son. Do you think they succeeded? No, they didn't. And then if you read the story about this eunuch, it's an amazing story. This eunuch eventually got passed around between a lot of successive people who wanted to be Roman emperors. Just like in the Old Testament, when Absalom tries to displace David, sleep with the concubine. That gives you status. So this poor eunuch got passed around between would-be successors to Rome. And yeah, it's a very sad story. It's a terrible story. You think it's terrible because you're a Christian. But this is the world Paul is engaging with. And Paul wants to tell the world, this is a terrible story. Young boys should not be slaves. Then they should not be castrated. And then they should not be forced to marry a Roman emperor because they look something like the wife that he killed. So Paul is reacting to this world. So next week we're going to get into this whole list of 28 and under. God gave them over, and then we're going to be unrighteousness, wickedness, greediness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malevolence, gossipers, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boasters, contrivers of evil, disobedient to parents, senseless, faithless, unfeeling, unmerciful. Paul is going to say the world we see today is because we have turned away from God and done what is natural in the one sense of the word. We've done what is unnatural in the other sense of the word. All right, we're out of time. Yeah, you got to come back. Let's pray. Lord, the world is a mess. And we would like to say, oh, it's all of those ungodly people. But we are ungodly too. And so we try to figure out what is natural. And we don't even have one definition of that word. And so, Lord, we thank you for what you've shown us and taught us. We thank you for the Apostle Paul. And we try to figure out, Lord, how we can follow you and how we can live. So give us your Spirit to instruct us and give us your Spirit to enable us. So hear our prayer. In the name of Jesus, amen.